Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online health psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in research methods. Very exciting. This will kind of conclude our last our vegetables before we get to our more potentially more exciting topics. But we need that kind of groundwork, that structure. And you know what? Maybe you're a big stat head. I've taught PhD research methods and stats for most of my teaching, about half and half, really. So maybe you're one of those people who are just really excited about research methods. So with that said, let's jump right into it. Beginning with why do research? Curiosity is the overarching motive for any piece of research. Humans always want to know more to better understand how things works. Approximately 8,000 published health psychology studies appeared in print in 2009, as compared to around 800 in 1990, a tenfold increase. So we have kind of an increase amount of publication reflecting kind of more PhDs, period, greater and kind of a greater interest in the field as health psychology continues to develop. And then we have our great, wonderful utopian idea that research is overwhelmingly motivated by curiosity, which I think honestly is a foundational piece to sound research, kind of an intrinsic interest and a care for the people that you're researching. Now, I will also say in a less magical world, also one of the big reasons why research has increased is because this idea of publish or perish in academia, aka you have to publish X amount of papers or at least have a Y amount of citations or something like that in order to kind of maintain your job. So, whatever, a dose of utopia alongside that little bitter medicine, but it is what it is. We all have constraints, as I talked about throughout this course. Next, let's operationally define some terms in the research process, beginning with theory. Theories are general explanations, whereas hypotheses are specific predictions derived from these explanations. Based on their tests of hypotheses, scientists accept the theory that generated these hypotheses, reject the theory outright, or revise it. So kind of stopping there momentarily, theories, again, kind of being these overall general explanation of complex social phenomenon or biological phenomenon, whatever. While hypotheses are specific predictions. So for example, the attachment theory. So kind of the idea that attachment with a caregiver will predict later life outcomes. So that's kind of an overall explanation. But one way you can test this is by, for example, recruiting participants, measuring their attachment, if they are securely attached to their mother, father, whatever, or insecurely attached, or whatever else, and then measure the quality of their romantic relationship as an adult. And basically test, just very basic stated, the correlation between their early childhood attachment and their later life romantic partner, the quality of that relationship. So that's the experiment. And then the hypothesis would be, based on the attachment theory, that secure attached children will have higher quality romantic relationships as an adult. So that is your hypothesis, your specific prediction given the attachment theory. Now, let's say, for example, that we do, in fact, find that. That is, participants with secure attachment to their primary caregiver as a child had higher rates or higher levels of romantic relationship partner as an adult. Okay, well, that hypothesis, I should say those results, are consistent with my hypothesis and thus support the overall theory. Now, let's say that doesn't happen, right? Let's say that instead, insecure attached children had higher qualities of their romantic relationships as an adult. Well, now my hypothesis was not supported, as stated. So, thus, what do we do with that theory, that attachment, that global attachment theory? Because that evidence would challenge that theory. Well, we can revise our theory, maybe say in certain circumstances, attachment really doesn't matter as much, or maybe it matters for when you're 15 years old, those early dating relationships, but not when you're 30 years old, whatever it is. Or you can just say, attachment theory sucks, I'll reject it outright. Continuing on, though, the research process involves selection and formulation of a research problem. So basically asking what your research question, what is the rationale for conducting this experiment? What are you trying to answer? This involves kind of research design, so like how are you going to measure this? How are you going to answer that research question or find evidence for them? It includes data collection, such as questionnaires, interview surveys, other things we'll talk about. You can also use existing data as a source material. Interpretation analysis, which is very important, as I talked about throughout this class and will continue will, and theoretically presentations and dissemination and application of your research findings in the real world, #real world. Some general misconceptions about what theory is. One misconception is that theory explains one specific event. Television reporters say something like, for example, the most likely theory for the robbery at the downtown McDonald's is the Hamburglar. This isn't a theory of the robbery. It is to explain only one event rather than a variety of diverse observation. It doesn't generate testable predictions. So a key part of theory is kind of looking at a collection of all kinds of research that we have, results that we have, looking at those research results and then coming up with a way to explain the variety of those results, those observations that previous research has found. This is not the case with our little robbery situation. Also, in this little robbery situation here with McDonald's, the use of theory here does not generate testable predictions. And that's kind of like the main, one of the main purposes of theory is that it produces testable predictions that then you can conduct experiments based on those predictions and then find evidence that either, again, support your theory or challenge your theory. Continuing on with other misconceptions about theory. Another myth is that scientific theory is merely a guess about how the world works, that it's, quote, just a theory. All general scientific explanations about how the world works are theories. A few theories are extremely well supported by multiple lines of evidence. For example, the Big Bang Theory, which we don't need to walk through here, which proposes that the universe began in a gigantic explosion about 14 billion years ago, helps to explain a diverse array of observations. Like all scientific theories, the Big Bang Theory can never be, quote, proven, because it's remotely conceivable that even a better explanation might come along one day. Nevertheless, because the theory is consistent with many lingering or differing lines of evidence, the overwhelming majority of scientists accept it as a good explanation. So we often use kind of like theory colloquially as just kind of like, oh, this is what I think, this is what I explain, or a hypothesis, or just an explanation in general of a specific event. And that's really not scientifically speaking what theory means. Now, obviously, you don't have to be like an asshole, like pedantic, annoying person and be like, oh, that's not a theory. But like when you're writing about science, or engaging in scientific writing, just kind of keep this in mind, and especially also when reading about the scientific theory or kind of just a research in general, which will be done quite often in this class. And which brings us kind of our final bullet point, this idea of proven. This is a big taboo for me. Do not write the word proven or prove in your writing. Instead, go with like evidence. This evidence supports, or there's overwhelming evidence that indicates, or stuff like that, because this is a piece of evidence that can support theory or a particular interpretation, but especially in social sciences, they cannot like quote unquote be proven, because we really cannot conduct like very systematic research like you could with like a cell on a petri dish or something like that. But rather we have kind of our best available interpretation in a given period of time, which of course will change given the scientific method and new evidence that is found. Another reason why you cannot really use prove is because, as we've talked about, just because you have a set of evidence, like an evidence, or like, I'll just, again, being very broad here, a correlation, it can be interpreted in multiple ways. And based on your theoretical background, your school of thought, you will interpret that evidence in different ways. So it doesn't necessarily prove a specific finding, but rather it, again, supports or does not support a particular interpretation, and thus kind of a particular theoretical framework that's used to explain a complex phenomenon. Research skills. A number of these research skills we're going to walk through momentarily. They include questionnaires, experiments, focus groups, surveys, and observational methods. But we'll walk through more specifics momentarily. Let's define quantitative research methods and qualitative research methods. Quantitative research methods kind of measure how much. It really revolves around numerical data. Many traditional methods in research designs are quantitative, placing emphasis on reliable and valid measurement and controlled investigations with experiments, trials, and surveys. Qualitative research methods, they attempt to understand why, what, when, and how. They include case studies, interviews, participant observations, direct observations, exploring documents, artifacts, focus groups, narratives, and archival records. They extrapolate evidence for a theory from what people say or write. Detailed information about participants from what people say or write. Now, they're listed here as a dichotomy, and that's really not necessarily the case. These things can cross over, but for our purposes here, these are kind of our outline here. With quantitative being kind of how much, what is your reaction time or something like that. Or I administer you a test, and I can measure how well you did on the test. I can give you a personality test. I can give you an IQ test or a mood test, depressive symptoms, something along those lines with specific numbers which indicate, how depressed you are, how introverted you are, what your IQ test score is, stuff like that. Versus kind of qualitative research kind of really is involved in kind of a lot of interpretations of data that isn't necessarily numerical in value. Some of those will include, which we'll talk about momentarily, are like focus groups, looking at archival research, diaries, kind of examining the writing of people, for example, is one of kind of the big methods, I should say, of qualitative research. Now let's walk through some more specifics here, beginning with case studies. What is it? It's an in-depth examination of an individual or a small number of individuals. Strengths can provide a rich picture of atypical development. Findings can be used to generate hypotheses for future larger studies. However, there are generalization questions. Now, each kind of approach to research methods or the specific methods you choose will always have strengths and weaknesses. There is no magical perfect study, and there's no magical perfect method. You just have to think through what research question you have and how best to measure it, what method you should use, or what method best will provide evidence that can support or kind of reject your hypothesis, or support and or not support like an overarching theory. So in the case of case studies, it's usually a very kind of small amount of people. It can even include one person. So for example, kind of following the life of somebody with a very, very rare neurological condition or something like that. So just collecting like a ton of information about like one or a few people, which can give you a rich amount of information about their lives. But kind of one of the downsides is that maybe those case studies, the information, the data, the results that you are able to generate from those case studies may not be generalizable to the rest of the population. That is because that population is possibly so atypical that the results that are derived, again, from that case study, that really small sample, may not be applicable to the greater population. Next, we have this idea called action research methods, which really is not talked about in kind of traditional research methods class. So this is kind of a fun one here. And ARM, the investigator acts as a facilitator, collaborator, or change agent who works with the stakeholders in a community or organization to help develop a situation or make a change of direction happen. Action research enables change processes to feed back into plans for improvement, empowerment, and emancipation. These different kinds of methods complement each other and are argued to be necessary if we want to have a complete picture of psychology and health. Which method is appropriate depends entirely on the question being asked and the context. So kind of our big takeaways here is that this is almost a little bit like translational research. You may have heard of that. But ultimately, the idea here is that a researcher is working with kind of the community of interest. You're not just swooping into like a global south country, collecting your data and then leaving and then publishing something. And then, your career advances, but it really doesn't help that population. Instead, you're trying to design research with the interests of that population in mind. Maybe they're actively helping you design said research. But ultimately, kind of the goal is not just to understand a phenomenon, whatever it is your research question is, but also to empower and theoretically emancipate these at-risk population. One of the big ones that's very common, in Scotland, was a woman kind of working with autistic participants, and kind of her argument is basically historical autistic research is very like negative, and she basically just argues is all incorrect. But ultimately what it does is kind of like dehumanize this population. Instead, what she does is she works alongside them to kind of, one, reframe the entirety of autistic research, but also she's developed like organizations for like autistic rights and stuff like this. So like her research kind of feeding into this kind of collaborative community effort, this organization to advocate for autistic rights and kind of reframe kind of with what she argues kind of a negative framing of autistic people and kind of a misinterpretation of results and research dealing with who sample autistic adults or children, with the goal to empower them and then also change the way that we like view autistic people in general. So continuing on, in a community, ARM aims to be emancipatory, helping to empower members to take more control over the way things work in their local community. Credited to Kurt Lewin. You may have heard of this in kind of like your history and systems of a psych class. But he argued every psychological event depends upon the state of the person and at the same time the state of the environment. One can hope to understand the forces that govern behavior only if one includes in the representation the whole psychological situation. So basically, he's arguing that you have to kind of take at least some of this approach while conducting research. You cannot just take people as kind of like in a vacuum individuals and draw conclusions kind of based on that data. Instead, you have to kind of take in this whole theoretical, whole psychological social situation, the entire state of the environment. So what are like levels of discrimination against autistic adults? How are they disenfranchised by the government, businesses, interpersonally, etc.? And it is only in that context of taking those kind of big, broader, macro examination that you can understand true developmental outcomes, and in our case, kind of true health outcomes in autistic adults or any population. And at the same time, working to kind of alleviate those structural barriers that exist within or against that particular group, autistic adults or like any group. Participant action research, PAR, is a prominent method in community health psychology. In PAR, researchers share power and control with participants and need to tolerate the uncertainty. Whereas action research tends to focus on individual and group level analysis of problems, PAR focuses on societal level analysis. Within PAR, broad societal conditions such as economic dominance and unequal distribution of resources are seen as the root of many problems. PAR is a suitable research approach in direct social actions that are organized to create change in entrenched scenarios where power imbalances are disadvantaging many of the actors. Yeek described how housing campaigns with groups of homeless people involved assisting in the organization of demonstrations and working with the media to raise awareness of people's housing needs. So basically our differentiation here, we have PAR and then we have action research methods. Action research method, collecting more data on individuals or groups. So our one like autistic group, for example, while PAR much more explicitly, much more directly taking a societal level analysis. So when they're interpreting results, they're really looking within a framework of, again, of like economic dominance, unequal distribution. All this, for example, like minority group has higher rates of cardiovascular disease, something like that. For PAR research method, or someone using that kind of that framework, would argue, well, this is kind of due to these larger societal issues. So history of oppression of those people living in greater areas of poverty, having less nutrition in their neighborhoods, having less money to pay for food, being more stressed out, due to like these big kind of structures working against them. So they are so the PAR researchers are much more kind of focused, explanatory, and even measuring kind of big, larger kind of like structures and like, again, power imbalance and stuff like this. So like this homeless researcher or this researcher sampling homeless people would probably argue, against like homelessness for some reason. So they would argue, people, if you were trying to figure out why are people homeless or something like that, they would argue, well, because there's lack of housing or something along those lines, lack of affordable housing, lack of mental health services. There's no federal like mental health service plan or something like that. So again, kind of these big, broader like structural kind of critiques and levels of analysis that are taken to hopefully then find evidence of that and then create a new structure / public policy or raise awareness or something along those lines to again address those kind of systematic barriers. Looking at a specific study, a specific empirical research study using PAR as a study of accidents in fishing community, used the PAR approach. They use drama, music, and associated art-based activities designed to promote safety awareness in 3 fishing communities in Newfoundland, Canada. Local residents planned and performed all these activities. Discussions were subsequently conducted with key community participants to clarify the process of implementing these projects. So kind of the idea for these people were they were worried about some kind of fishing concerns in the Newfoundland community. So local residents living there who are at greater risk of drowning or some kind of fishing related incident. And what they did was they worked with this local community to try and raise awareness and kind of address this kind of risk factor. And part of the research design was working with members of the community to design, again, kind of drama, music, kind of cultural arts kind of thing in the community that importantly was co-produced or led by members of that community. So we're still testing kind of the impact of these kind of programs on like safety awareness or like mortality and fishing incidents in Newfoundland. But what we're doing is kind of inviting the local community into that research design, having them kind of play a role now, a leading role, or at least a co-producer of kind of this research methods. Now, this is kind of really valuable because people in that community are going to know, like they're going to have firsthand knowledge of like, okay, where are our challenges? What do the local community like believe? What don't they believe? What do we need to prove? Whatever. They know how to talk to people. They kind of know the history of the town, etc. So, but kind of a challenge to this research approach is that you can see it's kind of less systematic. It's a little more of a messier approach because you're dealing with kind of working with people who are not like professional researchers. It can also be kind of a little hard to like wrangle them in this kind of thing. So it's a little messier of an approach, but the proponents of this argue it's ultimately kind of more meaningful, more rooted in the community. Thus, the kind of program's design will be more helpful, and the results identified will actually be more valid because it kind of incorporates this tacit local community knowledge in its research design. Quantitative methods include between-group designs. A between-group design allocates matched groups to different treatments. If the measures are collected at one time, this is called a cross-sectional design. If groups are tested at 2 or more times, this is called a longitudinal design. So, for example, is your gaming performance better when you are gaming while listening to the best UCF professors' YouTube lectures, aka me? You could sort some participants to a group where they listen to my YouTube lectures while gaming, and another group of participants who listen to Young Dolph, and then compare the 2 groups' gaming performances. So ultimately, between groups is that we're comparing kind of whatever outcome between groups. So in our case here, we're trying to measure if how well you are gaming, how well your gaming performance is in between 2 groups. One group is gaming while listening to my lectures. The other group is listening to Young Dolph while gaming. Okay. And then what you do is you look at how well they did. So whatever, they're playing Call of Duty, how many kills, how many deaths did they have? And then you say, you can compare the groups, and then, or I should say, which would provide you evidence to maybe recommend listening to a particular thing while gaming. So for example, say the Young Dolph group performed better at Call of Duty than the group who was listening to my lectures. Well, in that case, one way to interpret this is that listening to my lectures while gaming makes you a worse gamer. Thus, the recommendation is listen to Young Dolph while gaming. So it's kind of one way to test the effects of those different things you're listening to by, again, assigning what is being listened to 2 different groups. And of course, you can have multiple groups. This is kind of the simplest example. However, when we are comparing only treatment groups, a failure to find a difference between them on the outcome measure might be for one of 3 reasons. 1, they are equally effective. 2, they are equally ineffective. Or 3, they are equally harmful. For this reason, one of the groups should be a control group that will enable us to discover whether the treatment shows a different effect from no treatment. So in our gaming example, we need a control group, right? So then we can kind of determine if maybe both of listening to Young Doff or listening to me actually both decrease your gaming performance. So what you do is you create a third control group, aka in our case, a group who listens to nothing while playing Call of Duty. So now we have 3 groups. That is a control group, which is the group just playing Call of Duty, the second group listening to my lecture while playing Call of Duty, and the third group listening to Young Doff while gaming. Then we can compare the results of their gaming performance between all 3 groups and then make a determination about what is the most best way to increase gaming performance. And if you only collect that data one time, that is called a cross-sectional design. It's kind of like it's called a snapshot in time. Basically, you collect the data once between the groups and you're done. You never see those participants again. Collect the data and they are gone. And that's it. You got the data, and then it's up to the researcher to do with it what they will. Next, within participants' designs, the crossover and within participants' design, it's called either, is used when the same people provide measurements of a dependent variable at more than one time, and differences between the variables at different times are recorded. So before we had that cross-sectional design, again, wherein we collect data from participants one time and we never see them again. But within participants' design, we see those participants again. We have them complete experiment once, and then we have them complete a variation of the experiment or the same experiment a second time, or a third time, fourth time, fifth time, whatever the research design is. But ultimately, the point is that you are collecting data on these participants multiple times. So as in contrast to the cross-sectional design where we collect the data one time and then we never see them again. So for example, instead of separating gamer participants into 2 groups, I can measure gaming performance before intervention. That is, listening to my YouTube lecture while gaming. Next, I can measure gaming performance of the same participants again, with the intervention, gaming, while listening to my YouTube lectures. Finally, measuring the difference in an individual's gaming performance. Longitudinal studies are typically within subject design or a more complex model. So going back to kind of our gaming example, say we have 100 participants, and what we do is have the 100 participants play a game of Call of Duty while listening to nothing, okay? So nothing is being done, we're just watching them play Call of Duty. Next, we have them, and then we send them on their way. Then the participants come back into our lab, and this time they play Call of Duty while listening to my lecture. And then we see if there are differences within that person. Was there change within that person? So instead of separating people into groups, we're looking at change within an individual, okay? And theoretically, I can have them come back 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and each time listening to my lecture. And thus, maybe if my lecture makes you perform better at gaming, you would expect to see improvements in their gaming performance through time. So our big difference here between groups is we're comparing gaming performance between 2 groups, while within participant designs, we're evaluating changes within an individual, in our case, gaming performance. Next, a double-blind control. This is used in randomized control trials to try and prevent unintentional bias. Both the investigator and the participant or subject are prevented from knowing whether they are in a treatment or a controlled condition. A single-blind study is when only the participant is unaware of the condition they are being allocated. So you can imagine, for example, that I've created a new depression drug, or antidepressant drug, right? And we already have some that already exist on the market. So what we can do is we will obviously want to test if the new drug is better at decreasing depressive symptoms than the old drug. So what we can do is divide participants into one of 2 groups. One group can receive the old depressive drugs, and then a second group can receive the new antidepressive drugs. And then we're going to measure the rates of symptoms between those groups, and then use that information to determine if our new antidepressive drug performs better than the old depressive drug. Now, in a double-blind control study, basically what happens is the participants do not know what group they are in. They don't know if they're receiving the new drug or the old drug. Now, the double part is that the investigator or the person administering the drugs to the participants also don't know. And the goal is that you don't want your person who's administering the drugs to accidentally, unconsciously give off a little tip, tip to the participant that lets them know what group they're in. So maybe you give a participant the new drug. One of the drug administrators who are working on the research team gives a participant the new drug, and he, smirks or something like that, or he smiles or something like that. And then the participants like, oh, I got the new drug, and maybe they'll start acting differently. Like they'll start exercising more, they'll be happier, and those kind of changes in the participant will unintentionally and potentially impact the results, thus kind of messing up your study, and you don't really know if the new drug was actually the reason why depressive symptoms decreased, or if it was something else, like that person started exercising more, they just felt better, or whatever, they went to the club, they're having a great time. Now, versus a single blind study is where only the participants don't know what research group they are in. So the participants don't know if they got the old drug or the new drug. However, the person administering the drug who works for the research team does know. Thus, double versus single, kind of straightforward. Next, randomized controlled trials. They involve the systematic comparison of intervention using a fully controlled application of one or more treatments within a random allocation of participants to the different treatment groups. In real-world settings of clinical and health research, the so-called, quote, gold standard, that is, randomness, of the RCT cannot always be achieved in practice, and in fact may not be desirable for ethical reasons. We are frequently forced to study existing groups that are being treated differently rather than have the luxury of being able to allocate people to conditions. We may in effect be comparing the health policies and services of a number of different health clinics or hospitals. These are referred to as quasi-experimental design. So kind of the idea of random controlled trials is that it's pure random. You're putting people in groups at pure random, which allows for kind of theoretically equal distribution of resources between the groups. Like one group isn't like stacked in one thing versus the other. You want kind of a level playing field, thus what you achieve through pure randomness. Now, often this is completely impossible because participants have already existed in the real world and have lived in unequal lives. So, for example, say I want to test some kind of like anti-anxiety drug. I cannot, at like a newborn baby, I cannot say, all right, newborn baby, I'm going to send some of you to the slums, and other newborn babies, I'm going to send you to some rich mansion or something. And then I'm going to get 2 years from now, then I'm going to administer you the anti-anxiety drugs. You like ethically can't do that. It's like not a thing that can happen. so thus you like in kind of these real world experiments, in all kind of like data that you get, you're kind of also measuring kind of the background history of those people. Or like another example, say I'm measuring, health related behavior in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and comparing some health indicator to people living in Beverly Hills. All right. And then I find differences. I found the Congolese are just, they have more negative health related behaviors now, or more negative health outcomes. Now, are we measuring actually like their behaviors? What are we actually measuring here? Because automatically those people have lived in completely different environments. And what is part of those environments? Different health policies. They visit different hospitals. They visit different clinics. They have different access to resources. So maybe what we're actually measuring is not like this inherent difference between like some theoretical race difference or like countrywide difference, something along those lines, but rather kind of we're measuring is differences in kind of the health history or the specific health policies that those peoples lived in. And thus, these are really referred to as quasi-experimental. That is, you're not actually randomly assigning people towards groups. You're taking pre-existing groups with a whole, and why those groups actually exist are due to a whole host of historical, structural, interpersonal reasons, and then comparing those differences. So it's kind of quasi, so fake, pseudo experimental design is kind of the idea here, not the researchers randomly assigning people to specific groups. Another good kind of construct here statistically is this idea of nesting. We have patients who are nested within doctors. The doctors, in turn, may be nested within hospitals. If hospital 1 is poorly resourced and hospital 2 is well resourced, patient outcomes in the first hospital might be way worse than in the second. But if we fail to account for the context of the hospital, we'll lose that explanatory information and falsely look for causes of outcomes that are only at the doctor or patient level. So again, say, for example, we're comparing two patients or different patients along something like that. And let's just say, hypothetically, these all our participants happen to just fall within one of two hospitals. But we're not taking that into account. We're purely looking at specific health outcomes of these individuals. Now, what happens is by not kind of taking into account and statistically kind of testing for, and you can do this, kind of the fact that some of the participants were in hospital 1, which again was like poorly resourced, like a low income hospital, versus hospital 2, which is like state of the art equipment. Everybody, they have all the best stuff. They're all like really rich, kind of the idea. The fact that some of your participants were in hospital 2, the well-resourced hospital, and those participants had more positive health outcomes. It is highly likely that it's not just those people making individual life choices, but the fact that they exist, they are nested within a larger hospital. So kind of the point here is that you can at times believe that you're measuring individual differences between patients or any person, but instead people are actually nested. They are embedded within particular context, in this case, a hospital. So really the difference between these patients are actually being driven by the quality of the hospital, not their individual differences. So this is referred to as nesting. Next, Bonferroni corrections. You probably should have heard of this. If not, contact your local research methods professor. Kind of the idea of Bonferroni correction is this idea of 0.05. You probably have seen before p is less than 0.05. And kind of the idea of that, kind of broadly stated, this is not exactly correct, but it's fine, is that there is only basically a 5% chance that the results that you found is due to just randomness. That is a fake result. This is referred to as a type 1 error. So for example, I give some participants my new anti-anxiety drug, while I gave another group of participants the old anti-anxiety drug, and say the participants who received the new anti-anxiety drug had lower rates of symptoms related to their anxiety. Okay? And then we have p is less than 0.05. All that means is it's saying that there is only a 5% chance that this result isn't true, that some kind of error happened, that this is a kind of false significant result. Again, this is referred to as a type 1 error, okay? But kind of the big takeaway from Bonferroni is that when you do statistical tests, there's rarely you just do like one test. You usually do multiple statistical comparisons. And as a result, the probability of getting a significant result by chance, even if none exists, increases. That is a type 1 error. So basically, if you're conducting multiple tests, that 0.05 error, that is, you have a 5% chance that this is a type 1 error. Again, aka that you have a 5% chance that this result is not real. It happened by chance. It's just invalid for whatever reason. Well, the more times that you conduct tests, basically the greater probability of getting a result by chance increases. So for example, if you did 3 tests on a particular set of data, that would be 0.95. That is the probability that the results is not due to chance to the third power, because you did 3 tests. So it's 0.95 times 0.95 pi times 0.95. This equals approximately 0.6. Because the probability of no type 1 error is 0.95 for each test, and there are 3 tests. So now your new probability of no type 1 errors is 0.86. So again, that's the probability that your results are not due to chance, 86%, rather than the old 95%. Then the probability of making at least a 1 type error is that number subtracted from 1. So the probability of at least 1 incorrect significant results, significant results solely due to chance, or a type 1 error, is now 14% versus the old 0.05. So basically, we have a higher probability of reporting false positive results, or false significance results. Again, type 1 error. So kind of what Bonferroni does is there's a statistical way to kind of push that increased error, that 14%, back down to 5%. And that's what Bonferroni does. It's a statistical correction that has to be done while performing statistics, or there's a greater likelihood of reporting incorrect, false positive results. And this was especially a problem 56 years ago when there was kind of less statistical prowess and whatever, our computers are way faster and stuff now. A lot of false results. So it's definitely always important to kind of correct your, it's called Bonferroni, correct your kind of data analysis, or you're at risk of reporting and publishing false type 1 error data, aka false positive, false significant results, which isn't great. Now let's talk about confidence intervals, or CIs. This is defined as the interval around the mean of a sample that one can state with a known probability contains the mean of the population. Very easy to digest, obviously. Typically, the 95% or 91 or 99% confidence interval is stated in the results of a study that has obtained a representative sample of values. Generally, we accept a 5% chance that the range will not include the true population value. For example, mean heart rate for a sample might be 75, with a 95% confidence interval of 92.6 to 77.4. 72.6 to 77.4. So ultimately what we're getting at here, this confidence interval, is that when we're performing stats, we're kind of broadly stated here looking for the mean of a population, all right? But there's going to be some error within that mean of the estimated mean that we find in our statistics. And this is known as the confidence interval. It's kind of like the range of actual mean rate of whatever. So the simplest way to understand this is think of a political poll. So you'll often see X political candidate leads Y political candidate by 2 points. And then you'll see something like the margin of error is 4 points. And that's basically the confidence interval. So let's look at a kind of historical example from 1996. A CNN USA Today Gallup poll taken June 23rd through the 30th in 1996 of 818 registered voters showed Bill Clinton would beat his Republican challenger if the election were held now. And Bill Clinton would win 54 to 39%. The poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 4 points. So that means Bill Clinton led. The mean was 15 percentage points. So 15% winning by, whatever percentage winning by. But plus or minus 4 means that 15, okay, is kind of the estimated mean probability. But the actual true score can range between 11% and 19%. Thus, plus or minus. That's the confidence interval. It's the range in which that the true population mean is likely to occur. And you have a between 95 and 99% confidence. That's not exactly correct. But for the purposes of our class, it's good enough. Basically, what it actually means is that if you conducted this poll 100 times, 95 or 99 times, the true lead of Bill Clinton's lead would range between, again, 11 to 19%, because the true mean is 15 and the plus or minus, the confidence interval, the margin of error is 4. Thus 15 minus 4 and 15 plus 4. So if I say that Dr. Bob is leading in the polls as next president of UCF by 5 points, plus or minus 3, that means that Bob actually leads between 2 percentage points or 8 percentage points. So basically, just know that kind of broad outline here, that it's kind of a range of the actual true mean difference, because I will definitely give you an example of confidence interval. Moving on to effect size. An effect size is the strength of the association between study variables and outcome as measured by an observed difference or correlation. The most common are Cohen's D and Pearson's R's. The effect size is a measure of the importance of an effect rather than a statistical difference. If a study has found significant difference between groups, the two groups are different, that is, by p is less than 0.05, but with a small effect size, that is probably not very meaningful. If a group found a non-significant group difference, the two groups are the same, that is, p is less or greater than 0.05. But with a large effect size, it's probably worthwhile for you to consider it a little bit more. So kind of the point of effect size is, again, kind of this way to measure the strength of that correlation. All p-values are telling you is that the probability of this difference actually existing is, again, less than 5%, that the difference between groups actually exists. While the effect size are measuring kind of the magnitude, the strength of that difference. So, for example, say we have two groups and their differences seem like very, 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 very large. Like it's a very large effect size difference. But our P is 0.06 and we're like, oh my God, it's not 0.05. What can we do? Well, the situation is 0.05 is basically an arbitrary number. It's not. It's just a thing that we created that we've agreed on. It's not like a law in stone. Actually, many people now reject the P's whole situation. That's a whole different conversation. But kind of the idea here is just because there's a significant difference between those groups does not mean that significant difference is either large or actually in any way meaningful. Effect sizes can typically be read like a correlation coefficient. That is, they range from -1 to +1, or really the absolute value of 1, so ranging from 0 to 1. An R that's equals a 0.1 or less is characterized as a small effect size, while R equals 0.3, that is from 0.11 to 0.3, generally referred to as a medium effect size, and R that equals 0.5, that is 0.5 or above, is referred to as a large effect size. Again, these are also conventions. People have different ones. Statistics is not like an exact, it is a math, but there's a lot of interpretation. It's an art to it as well. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2. There's a lot of interpretation and debate within statistics. So let's talk about an example. So say we find a significant correlation of R equals 0.06 between IQ and finger length in a sample of 500,000 people. Yet it's so minuscule in magnitude that it would be essentially useless for predicting anything. It has a small effect size. So kind of the experiment here is that we want to test a correlation between fingernail length and IQ. And say we find a significant difference. Like we sample 500,000 people and we find a significant difference. That is, P is less than 0.05. But then say our R, that is our effect size, is 0.06, which would be very, very small. So basically, this is stating here that the true magnitude of difference, the true magnitude of association, I should say, between IQ and finger length is actually very, very small, to such an extent that it has something, there lacks something that's very important, that is practical significance. What is the actual meaning? What can we take from this to apply to the real world? And in this case here, such a small effect size basically means that very, very little. So the point here is just because there's a significant difference between the groups does not mean it's actually a meaningful difference because of this effect size situation. Thus, when you're interpreting results, it's important not just to keep in mind that there's differences, that p-value is less than 0.05, but also the effect size. What is the strength of that difference? What is the strength of that correlation? And that is, some people argue, far more important than the p-values. Because you can imagine, for example, that a p-value is 0.06, but we have our R is 0.6, which is a massive effect size that you would basically never find in psychology. But in that case, it's okay, well, we have a p that's 0.06, but our R is massive. So okay, do we just throw this away and never report it? Probably not. You should still report that data. That's very, very important. And just because the probability is that this is a false result is 6% instead of 5%, doesn't mean you throw away everything with an effect size that large. So again, and this is just kind of two examples here of how to the nuances and the art and the art of interpreting statistics. So make sure you know the differences between these effect sizes and understand that a small effect size with significant differences, statistically speaking, that is a p being less than 0.05, may lack practical differences. Make sure you know that. Next, a meta-analysis, the use of statistical techniques to combine the results of primary studies addressing the same effect into a single pooled measure of effect size with a confidence interval. The results of multiple studies addressing the same question are synthesized to produce overall conclusions. It aids in the confidence of research findings. So, for example, say I'm very much interested in the impact of natural disasters on birth weight. So mothers who experience a natural disaster while pregnant, how do those natural disasters impact their offspring's birth weight? Now, obviously, researchers are going to conduct a single study on whatever hurricane, Katrina, or XYZ hurricane, right? So what a meta-analysis does is they basically send out a call to all researchers / look at their data online of previously conducted experiments, and they dump all those results and basically into a massive database. And then what those researchers do is perform statistical tests on that pooled set of results or data. And then from that pool results or data, these researchers who are conducting a meta-analysis can have more robust kind of results. Basically, the idea is because they took and collected data from every previous research study on the impact of natural disasters on birth weight. Now they have this super rich pool of sample that a single experiment would not have. So basically it aids in our confidence of research findings. So we find that natural disasters across all these 100 different studies, all these different hurricanes, earthquakes, whatever, all negatively impact birth weight. Now we have a much more confident set of evidence to support the idea that natural disasters, experiencing a natural disaster while pregnant, is associated with higher rates of low birth weight. Moving on to qualitative research methods, as we've already stated, they aim to understand the meanings, purposes, and intentions of behavior, typically not necessarily just the amount or quantity of a behavior. There's a huge variety of methods available. They include focus groups, diaries, blogs, grounded theory, historical analysis, and narrative approaches. Diaries and blogs. Diaries can be prepared by the researcher or participant or both, and they can also be quantitative or qualitative or both. As I said before, kind of the dichotomy between the quant and qual can be a little fuzzy, but it's fine. Diaries can be compared to the time charts that have been used by health professionals for generations to track changes in the health status of individuals. Blogs also provide a rich source of data on different illnesses and conditions and lay ideas on healthy living. So let's jump to some specific examples here. Feinstein et al. In 2017, that basically means Feinstein and their friends, it's the other researchers. So Feinstein and the gang, they conducted a weekly diary study of minority stress, coping, and internalizing symptoms among gay men. Participants were asked to report weekly levels of discrimination, internalize homonegativity, rejection sensitivity, internalizing symptoms, and coping techniques. You don't really need to know the specifics here. Findings demonstrate that gay men's negative thoughts and feelings about their sexual orientation and anxious expectations of rejection vary from week to week, and this weekly fluctuation has an impact on mental health. Further, findings implicate disengaged coping as a mechanism through which minority stressors influence internalizing symptoms. So in this case here, Feinstein and the gang, they had these participants, gay men, kind of report their levels of stress, and basically how they coped, how they dealt with it. Every week, they would just log in on some diary and just type out a blog. So they would fill out basically a scale of 1 to 10, for example, of I feel, how well you feel today, but also kind of more qualitative oriented information. So not completing a test, but literally just typing out a blog, what happened to you today? Why do you feel this way? And what the job of the researchers is to take that information and just code it. You don't need to know how, but ultimately the point here is that you're collecting data through this weekly or daily diary, which can reveal different results than just having participants fill out basically a standardized checklist or something like that, or a survey. So it can be, it's kind of, you have to take a different kind of method to examine that data, but you get kind of results that aren't necessarily captured by a standardized measure of whatever personality or there's symptoms that you experience within a week. And you also see this in blogs. You can just go to a person's blog and kind of read why they feel that way, what they feel, kind of their overall layperson's understanding of what it is that they're going through. For example, if they have cancer or something like that. So that's kind of a unique set of unique, but it's a rich data set that necessarily cannot necessarily be captured again through kind of standardized measurements, which researchers can then interpret to understand the mental well-being of people with cancer, or kind of how they view cancer, what their coping mechanisms are, how they feel about the medical profession, what resources they need, those kind of things. Ultimately, though, kind of outside of a controlled experiment setting. Focus groups, they comprise one or more group discussions in which participants focus collectively upon a topic or issue, usually presented to them as a group of questions, although sometimes as a film, a collection of advertisements, cards to sort, a game to play, or a vignette to discuss. This was used initially in market research. A distinctive feature of the focus group as a method is its generation of interactive data. So the kind of focus group, the classic focus group that you're familiar with, for market research being used using focus groups, it's kind of straightforward here. You give them a product and you're like, what do you think about the product? Do you like it? Is it cool? Like, here's a new car commercial. Oh, do you think you're going to be a super cool guy? You're going to fly to the moon. You're going to get all the ladies and do all the drugs, and you're going to be a badass on the road. So it's kind of like getting that information to then obviously then like refine your advertisements or whatever else that is that you're trying to sell. But ultimately, the broader focus group is that you give them a topic or a film or something like that, and you have them quote unquote focus on that topic and have like a conversation about that topic, which again can go in kind of multiple directions depending on how the focus group is structured, which we will get to momentarily. So, for example, Jones et al., Jones and our friends in 2014, carried out a focus group and telephone interviews with patients in rural areas to examine the management of diabetes in rural South Australia. 3 themes of barriers and facilitators to type 2 diabetes management emerged at an interpersonal level, that is, denial of illness, motivation, knowledge and skills, and lack of time. There were interpersonal barriers, which include stress in relationships, organizational barriers, such as access to recommended foods, transport, health professionals, and exercise options, and societal barriers, which include engagement in societal attitudes. So Jones and his friends basically had telephone interviews with a big group. They had a group call, Zoom, if they had that, whatever, it doesn't matter. And they said, all right, Australian people who are living in rural South Australia, God bless those people, dealing with those massive bugs. And we're going to ask you who have diabetes, we're going to ask you, what are some barriers to managing your diabetes? And you really can't just do that in, like, again, a standardized, necessarily like 1 to 10. How do you feel? Rather, this is kind of a more conversation-oriented kind of method. And again, what emerged here is some collection of interpersonal, organizational, and societal barriers to properly managing diabetes. So you can see like the fruitful, rich data that we're able to be identified in these focus groups, which then theoretically in return can use this information to whatever adjust policy structures or help people deal with their stress through, I don't know, some kind of therapy or whatever, some kind of income program, whatever it is their issues are. But ultimately, those issues are theoretically more rooted in their kind of community, and thus kind of programs to address them could potentially be more effective because, again, it's kind of, it's literally indicated, these problems and barriers are literally indicated by the population of interest. Moving on to semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews are designed to explore the participant's view of things with the minimal amount of assumptions from the researchers. A semi-structured interview is more open-ended than a structured interview and allows the interviewee to address issues that he or she feels relevant to the topics raised by the investigator. In preparing for the interview, the researcher should develop an interview guide. This includes a combination of primary and supplemental questions, which can be introduced at the appropriate time of the interview. So basically the idea with semi-structured versus structured interviews is the degree to which you structure the interviews. That is, the degree to which you want them to answer specific questions versus like, okay, my participant is talking about this thing. I didn't think about that. Let's let that participant expand on that issue. So it's kind of less, again, kind of a predetermined structure to the interview. So there is some structure, but you kind of leave room for the participant to kind of lead the discussion, ultimately to, again, identify barriers to treatment, identify barriers to participation in like positive health behaviors, with the goal, again, being that these results are kind of more, it's called ecological validity. You don't need to know that, but kind of like rooted in kind of their hashtag lived experience, which then theoretically would give you a better understanding of the context in which these people live in, and thus you can address barriers within their specific context through whatever, again, policy, therapy, whatever. Next, discourse analysis. These are sets of procedures for analyzing language as used in speech or text. It focuses on the language and how it is used to construct versions of, quote, social reality, and what is gained by constructing events using the particular terms being used. So kind of the overarching idea of discourse analysis is that all language is used to construct used and represents how we see reality. It is how we construct our version of social reality. Language, how we frame things, tell you about how people see the world, how they see themselves, and you have to basically read into this. All language is social in nature. If you want to be nerd out, you need to know this. The social cognitive theorists basically make this argument that like all language is basically social in nature. It's all social meaning. Now let's look at specific types of discourse analysis. There are two primary forms. The first, discursive psychology, evolved from the work of Potter and Weatherall in 1987. They were concerned with the discursive strategies people use to further particular actions in social situations, including accounting for their own behaviors and thoughts. And the Foucault discourse analysis, FDA, was developed by Ian Parker in 1997. They criticized the previous approaches evading issues of power and politics. FDA aims to identify the broader discursive resources that people in a particular culture draw upon in their everyday life. So again, the idea of discourse analysis is to really kind of understand how people are using languages to construct their social reality. And that language, that social reality that's being constructed is always going to be shaped by these larger kind of power dynamics, these larger kind of like macro situations. Our culture, power, politics, environment, they shape how we think and how we talk. And because our language is, again, representative of our constructed social reality, of where we see ourselves in the world, how we think about the world, that in effect will also reflect, again, those kind of broader structures. It's kind of the argument by Foucault, without getting into too long of a discussion on Foucault. Thus, kind of FDA analysis proponents, they argue, hey, listen, just doing a standard kind of discourse analysis while ignoring these big, broader structural things is you guys just kind of evading power and politics because for whatever reason, you don't want to be controversial or something. So instead, you cannot just analyze that person's language within that person. It's not just what they think. What they think is also a reflection, again, of like culture, structure, historical era that you live in, all these things. And you should keep that kind of in mind and attempt to measure it. So let's walk through an example here with two asynchronous, that is non-real-time online focus groups were conducted. It consisted of 6 topics chosen as areas of importance, which would help us to understand the social construction of health. So how does a person understand health? How do they talk about health? And how they talk about health, what does that reveal about their, again, understanding of health? And how does that understanding of health, how is that embedded? How is it nested within these larger cultures, politics, historical era, whatever? So this included some of the topics discussed included participants' definition of health, their experiences and reactions to being ill, perceptions of when and how to use health services and beliefs about health issues, specific to men and beliefs about men's interest in health. They asked participants about their thoughts on talking online as opposed to face-to-face about their health. Young men are interested in their health and construct their health practices as justified, while simultaneously maintaining masculine identities surrounding independence, autonomy, and control over their body. So kind of this is kind of getting at why might men have lower lifespans, or maybe are less likely to go to a doctor or talk about like their illnesses and stuff like that. So this is kind of, so you're asking them about them, like how they define health to men. You're asking men to define health, asking men to discuss what it feels like to be ill health, what are the reactions to it, what are their views on health services and beliefs, and what would increase their likelihood of kind of talking about their health. And again, so you're having this set of responses that you analyze, with the idea being that you're examining themes found within the responses. And those themes, again, will represent, again, kind of greater cultural understandings of health and masculinity in this case. So thus, what they found was that young men were actually concerned with their health, but they were also concerned with maintaining masculine identities surrounding independence, autonomy, and control over their bodies. So this kind of idea of masculinity wrapped up with their understanding of what health is, when they're likely to use health-related services, and what makes them more likely to kind of talk about their health. So again, it's not just those men in an isolated vacuum, but rather the idea of manhood is there's a greater kind of cultural understanding of what manhood is, which was reflected in these results. Historical analysis. health and illness, and all human developmental outcomes are socially and historically located phenomenon. All human outcomes are embedded within historical periods and contexts. If our environmental context impacts our outcomes, then understanding said environmental context is critical to research design, interpretation of results, and interventions. All researchers, including health psychologists, need also to be reflexive about the history of their own discipline. It arose at a particular historical period, sometimes described as late modernity. So this is, again, important, going back to that broth from dinner point, argument, his theory, is that all developmental outcomes are historically and socially located phenomenon. That is, all results take place within specific historical time periods. Also, all research questions, our research designs, what our assumptions, our hypotheses are always going to reflect specific historical factors. So how we feel about a group, what are the cultural belief systems of a given, whatever, state, country, world within a given historical period. All these things are going to impact results. So, for example, what is the impact of losing your job on a health outcome? Well, if that occurred during the Great Depression, an older adult, a 6-year-old losing their job, well, they're kind of screwed. Probably their health outcomes aren't going to be great. Why is that? Because Social Security doesn't exist. Medicare doesn't exist yet. They're in deep trouble. Versus now, theoretically, that those older adults now have access to Social Security and Medicare. So the impact of losing their job at 70 years old may not be, or may be different than it was 100 years ago. Or, as we kind of talked about, eugenics, kind of interpreting those genetic differences in peace and then applying that to racial minority groups, because especially at the time, obviously still exists, but those groups treated as like inferior. So the research question is basically like, okay, how do I prove that these racial groups are inferior, and how do we take that scientific theory of genetics with these plants, and how do we apply it to the humans? And what policies should we include that reflect those current understandings of genetics and current understandings of kind of racial and power dynamics? And in the case that we talked about is sterilization was one. So it's also important to keep in mind that our research questions, our research design, our interpretation, the effects of our results are all going to always be impacted by these historically and socially social factors, because all research, all our understandings of health, illness are all historically located phenomenon. Now, some historical researchers use this method in a descriptive manner, often in laudatory terms. Conversely, there are those who adopt a more critical approach and attempt to dissect the underlying reasons for the development of the discipline. That is, why do researchers believe this? Why are these the research questions asked? Why are these the assumptions in our research? What is the social function of this research? Why might these results emerge in the first place? Why did they emerge in this specific time period or among these people/groups? Such textual analysis needs to be guided by an understanding of the political and philosophical ideas of the period. As such, psychologists have much to gain by detailed historical research, that is, historical analysis, on the development of health beliefs and practices. So this is basically can kind of include a critical review of your field. Why are researchers super obsessed with IQ during the early 20th century? Well, part of the reason is going to be because it's kind of rooted in eugenics. And again, some of the assumptions the research questions asked are going to be kind of rooted in sexism, racism, being against disabled people. Why did the APA list homosexuality as a disorder until whatever it was, 1960s, late 60s? Why was that assumed, even though we have evidence of across species and across other cultures? Why was it assumed that? And then you can kind of break it down from kind of a historical perspective. And with the goal being is okay, hey, let's not do that again, and kind of think through what are the ethical underpinnings of the research questions being asked. What is ultimately the social result of finding maybe differences between these groups? And that's again going back to the autistic researcher who's interested in autism in Glasgow. she's ultimately kind of getting at like, what is the social function? What is the kind of point? Even though it's just ignoring the validity of the results, which this researcher also rejects. But what is the social function? What is our goal here to say? Okay, yes, for sure, autistic people lack X, Y, Z. They are. She would characterize it as autistic people are asocial, whatever, dangerous, lacking, just massive deficits. So, like, what is the point of that, and why are we understanding disability in those terms? What does that understanding reflect in our greater like society is kind of the question here. When I did research in the Democratic Congo, I did a historical analysis based on like 20 years basically of reading hundreds of news articles about the history of the Congo and to kind of identify specific understandings of the Congo and ultimately to try and identify stressors that were meaningful within that formerly colonized populations. So kind of more emancipatory, kind of research-oriented questions and kind of historically rooted, theoretically more ecologically valid, again, kind of more results that reflect the actual real-world concerns of that population. Not just taking, okay, well, we ran this test in the US, let's go apply it to this context. And then say, oh, look, they performed worse on these tests, therefore, and then the question is like, okay, they did worse on that test, therefore, what is your interpretation of that? You can interpret it in like multiple ways, and throughout specific historical periods, some interpretations are more prevalent than others, which then raise the question, why? And finally, skipping ahead to narrative approaches. A narrative approach is concerned with the desire to seek insight and meaning about health and illness from participants. The narrative approach assumes that human beings are natural storytellers. Stop me there for a second because basically, hey, time is, without getting too theoretical, kind of meaningless here. Like you're on Earth for 100 years, Earth's universe, we got billions of years old. So time kind of irrelevant. But all humans think in terms of kind of like time. We are natural storytellers is kind of the assumptions. In our mind, we have like an arc, a story arc or whatever. We're moving through time, even if whatever, you believe in multiple lives, whatever. But ultimately, we are storytelling. We're trying to make sense of whatever 100 years on Earth, given like billions of years that actually exist like in the universe. So a kind of a feature of humanity is that we are naturally storytellers. Is kind of the idea here. It gives you like a coherent sense of self. So the most popular source of material for the narrative researcher is the interview. A particular version of the narrative interview is the episodic interview, in which a researcher encourages the participant to speak on a variety of particular experiences. The narrative approach involves trying to see the interconnections between events rather than separating them. They attempt to identify similarities and differences in the structure and the content of the narrative. So kind of like one common approach is kind of this like life story narrative. So you kind of ask a person like, oh, tell me about your life. When were you, whatever, the best parts of your life, when you felt like healthy, when you felt ill, and they're kind of just telling a story about their lives. And the kind of the goal of the researchers is to not think of each one of those events as kind of like distinct, occurring in a vacuum, but rather all events of a person are inherently kind of interconnected between them. Each kind of event logically, or not necessarily logically, but flowing into the next. And thus kind of you'll recognize certain themes within a person's life about what it means to be healthy, what it means to be happy, what it means to be sick, what is fulfillment, what is subjective well-being. These kind of things kind of fleshed out through this kind of narrative approach, wherein again, they're kind of outlining your life. And those specific examples, those interconnections between real-world events that happen to you, help explain how, or help allow the researchers to interpret the meaning of health and illness within that person's and groups of people. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.